Peace be upon you all. Thanks for having me today. Our lecture today is the biology of language. It is the third chapter of our syllabus, psycholinguistics. We are following the book entitled The Fundamentals of Psycholinguistics by Eva M. Fernandez and Helen Smith Calles, 2001. We already took basic concepts of psycholinguistics. We defined psycholinguistics as the study of language acquisition, storage, comprehension, and prediction. Also, we defined neurolinguistics as the study of the neutral and electrochemical basis of language development and use. Also, we took some basic concepts. They were supposed to be an introduction for what we are going to have today. So we have an agenda that is an introduction. Then we are going to take language is species specific. Language is universal in humans. Language need not be taught nor cannot be suppressed. Children everywhere acquire language on a similar developmental schedule. Language development is triggered by the environment. Anatomical and physiological correlates for language. Language lateralization. Neuroanatomical correlates of language processing. The search for a genetic basis for language. Reading and writing as cultural artifacts. And then we have the study questions. Our main concern in this lecture is to prove that language is biologically based. That is, language is a system controlled by the brain, which is different from but closely linked to a general cognition. As such, language is an aspect of a human biology. How to prove that language is a biological system that is based on biology? We have certain criteria to follow. These criteria are put by Lemberg, 1967. These criteria are conditions for a system to be biological. The first one, its cognitive function is species specific. 2. The specific properties of its cognitive functions are replicated. The cognitive processes and capacities associated with this system are differentiated spontaneously with maturity. Certain aspects of behavior and cognitive function for this system emerge only during infancy. And lastly, certain social phenomena come about by spontaneous adaptation of the individual to the behavior of other individuals around him. Now, how to satisfy the first condition of language being biological, that every species has a communicative system of certain kind, whether animals, insects, or on the top of them, human beings. A species specific means that a system is likely to be part of the genetic makeup of members of that species. No other species has a communicative system used by humans. Based on two claims, and these claims will prove Lemberg's first hypothesis or first criterion. Number one, no other animals talk, nor do any animals have a gestural system with the organizational structure of a human language. The second claim, no animals can be taught a human communication system. Marine experiments were done on pyramids or parrots to acquire a human language. There were some success, but these animals couldn't produce a human language which is equal to what we have, to what human beings have. For example, Washoe chimpanzee was taught about 100 words. It was doing perfectly by certain commands and orders, but it couldn't distinguish the syntactic structure of these words and doesn't have a creative syntactic system, which is contrary to human beings. Now, these two claims prove that language is species specific, which is specific to human beings. Another point, which is language is universal in humans. The biological system must be universal to all members of the species. And we have two claims in order to prove the second criterion of Lemberg. All human babies are born with a brain that is genetically prepared to organize linguistic information. The second is that all human language have universal properties. And language universals are product of a human neurology. That is, put a hypothesis: if language were not biologically based, then what? There would be no necessity for all of them to have a similar organization. A person's ability to acquire and use language is as natural as a person's ability to walk, or another, like for example, a bird's ability to fly. So it is natural in human being to have language, and this language is a kind of ability like any ability of walking or drinking. It is necessary for all human beings. We by here covered the second criterion of Lemberg under language is universal in humans. Now we come to the third criterion, which proves Lemberg's hypothesis. Language need not taught nor can be suppressed. It means that biological systems consist of processes that are differentiated or developed spontaneously as the individual grows. With the growing of human beings, the system can be differentiated, but of course all human beings, all children, all over the world learn the same learn in the same process as all other human beings in the world. The biological systems consist of the processes that are differentiated or developed spontaneously as the individual grows. Language acquisition in the child is a naturally unfolding process. This is spontaneous. Every normal human who experiences language in infancy acquires a linguistic system. And children need to hear language in order to acquire. This is part of environment. Without hearing certain language, without listening to language, it is difficult for children, for human beings to learn the language. So it is a must to hear it. And this is called interactive input. When there is interactive input, children can learn. Interactive input is important for children during the years they are acquiring language. People acquire language at about the same speed during and about the same lifespan all over the world. Children they learn language at the same speed, at the same rate, except of pathologies, of course. The biological driven processes of language acquisition even drive the creation of new languages. not only the language development, but also the creation of new languages. Uh, we come to our third point, which is children everywhere acquire language on a similar schedule. No matter where in the world children acquire language, and this process is common to all children in the world. Babies coo in the first half of the first year and begin to bubble in the second half. The first word comes in the first half of the second year for just about everyone, all in societies. Babies go through a one-word stage followed by a period of early sentences of increasing length. Finally, the complex sentences begin. By the age of 5, the basic structures of languages are taking place, although final tuning goes on until late childhood. Um, what about the variations? Of course, variation is conditioned by individual characteristics. It has nothing to do with biological variation. It comes with language interaction with the society. But basically, all children follow the same path of language development. Variation is conditioned by individual characteristics of the child rather than the language being acquired. Development sequence to language acquisition is independent of the language being acquired. And this similarly is the process of acquisition. The process of acquisition also is independent of the language being acquired. It has nothing to do. It is all common to human being. For children everywhere, there seems to be a critical period in the acquisition of the first language. All human beings have to come across a critical period which is critical for the acquisition of language. If human beings don't learn a language within this period, it is difficult to be a native speaker or similar to native speaker. Of course, they learn the language, but not as efficient as their peers. In the case of a girl, Jenny is a Californian girl who was locked in a closet by an abusive father for the first 13 years of her life. And during that time, Jenny's ability of language was destroyed. But after she was rescued in November 1970, researchers from the University of California at Los Angeles worked for years with her to help her acquire English verbally. She could acquire that language, but her ability to communicate verbally using formal phonological and syntactic system of English was not as accurate and efficient as her peers, because she was isolated during her critical period. Aging is another factor that is related to the acquisition of language. With old age, language learning, language acquisition becomes difficult or harder. Younger people learn or acquire language easier than the elderlies. And this all, what mentioned above, satisfied Lemberg's fourth criterion about that children everywhere acquire language on a similar schedule. And now we come to language development is triggered by the environment, and this has to do with Lindbergh's fifth criteria about the necessity of stimulation and interaction with the environment. Certain biological systems will not develop without environmental stimuli to trigger them, which is necessary. Children will not develop language if language is not accessible in their environment or nobody is there to interact with them. Interaction is very important for language development. Environmental input is a stimulus that triggers internal development. Now we come to anatomical and physiological correlates for language. Language is that it is stored in the brain, and more importantly, that language function is localized in certain areas of the brain. Normally, we have two areas in the brain. We have the right hemisphere and we have the left hemisphere. These are the two areas in the brain. If any damage happens to one of these areas, of course, language abilities will be affected. We have certain terms for this breakdown of language abilities. For example, we have that is called aphasia. Aphasia is a general language impairment linked to brain damage or a brain lesion. Three types of aphasias we can distinguish: Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, and we have another one. We'll come to it later on. Aphasia, as we mentioned, aphasia is a language impairment linked to a brain lesion. First, we have Broca's aphasia. This is related to halting, thoughtful speech associated with damage involving Broca's area in the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere. Wernicke's aphasia is called fluent aphasia, is characterized by fluent meaningless strings, and it is caused by damage involving Wernicke's area. The speech associated with the Broca's aphasia has been characterized as agrammatic, means there's a problem in the prediction, not in the reception, which is opposite to Wernicke's aphasia. That is, there's a strength of the grammar, for example, organized clauses and phrases, but these strengths tend not to be coherent because there's a problem in the perception. Aphasias are purely linked to language and not to motor abilities or audition, that is auditory. Then another third type of aphasia is called Sylvian fissure, which is deep into the cortex, and it is related to or is associated to with language function. Language lateralization. What does it mean, language lateralization? It means that language function is located in one of the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, as we mentioned before. We have contralateral. What is contralateral? It means the right side of the body is controlled by the left motor and sensory areas, while the left side of the body is controlled by the right motor and sensory areas. It is a matter of opposites. Thus, we can put it in this way: left-handed people, we have left-handed people. This is the left hand. Left-handed people have what right dominant areas. They are the dominant. The control comes from the right, while the right-handed people have their control in the left dominant motor areas. Experts want to test which side of the brain is responsible for language. They use certain tests. For example, we have water test. It is what is water test? It is sodium amytal, which is injected into one of the two hemispheres of a patient's brain. Another test is a brain mapping, which is widely used to localize language function. Conjunctomy. The two hemispheres of the cortex are separated by cutting the callosum. What is callosum? It is a thick sheath of nerve fibers joining the two hemispheres. The step that is missing for the person who has a split brain is the information transfer from the right to the left. By cutting the two hemispheres, what is missing is the connection between the two hemispheres. There's what is called the advantage of right ear for language. What is the advantage of right ear? The advantage of right ear. This is the right ear. What is the advantage if information comes through this ear? Of course, if information comes through the right ear, it goes directly to the left hemisphere. But if the information goes to the left or through the left ear, then it has to go to the right hemisphere and then to the left hemisphere, and this takes a longer time than if it comes through the right ear. So this is the advantage. Brain plasticity. For example, in a child who has a dysfunction of the left hemisphere from his birth, then the right hemisphere takes the role of this function, takes the function of language, and of course this is what we call the plasticity. Neuroanatomical correlates of language processing. Neuroanatomical processing or neuroanatomical correlates of language processing. There's neuroimaging. Neuroimaging, what does it focus on? It focuses on identifying neuroanatomical correlates for the competence repositories and performance mechanisms for language. Then we have electroencephalography. Electroencephalography, EEG, is attaching electrodes to the scalp at different locations. What is meant by event-related potential? Event-related potentials are changes in the electrical patterns of the brain that are associated with the processing of various kinds of linguistic stimuli. The brain has different electrical responses to every type of linguistics anomalies. We have N400 component, P600 component, closure positive shift, P800, and we have functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and also we have positron emission tomography, this is PET. What is event-related potentials? Are changes in the electrical patterns of the brain that are associated with the processing of various kinds of linguistic stimuli, as we mentioned before. We mentioned as well that the brain has different electrical responses to different types of linguistic anomalies. If we have semantic anomalies, then one of the best known ERP effect is the N400 component that is sensitive to semantic anomalies. Syntactic anomalies or violations, we use, or experts use, P600 for positive voltage between 600 and 1000 milliseconds, also called the syntactic positive shift or SPS, that elicits the syntactic violations or syntactic anomalies. The closure positive shift is responsible for intonational boundaries, suprasegmental features. Intonational boundaries inside sentences elicit positive. P 800 is the intonation of a sentence that does not match its form. Functional magnetic reasoning imaging or resonance imaging, fMRI, and positron emission tomography, PET, provide information about the brain areas of the implicated in language processing. The search for a genetic basis for language. The ultimate indicator of the biological nature of language would be the discovery of the genetic basis of language. Genetic basis of language. Studies that examine the heredity of a particular trait or disorder in several generations of a family. Many studies were or have been done on the relation between heredity and particular disorder. They discovered that genetic anomalies is associated or are associated with language development inherited. There's a certain gene which is called FOXP2 is a gene that was implicated in the language disorders of an extended family. These disorders were attributable to a mutation of the FOXP2 gene, which was transmitted by heredity. All complex behaviors are attributed to the interaction of many genes. Not only this gene, but this gene is one of many that are related to heredity, means that language development are related to heredity. These genes are used in order to show the relationship between language development and disorder. Reading and writing as cultural artifacts. The question is, are reading and writing also biological or not? Are these like speech or not? Of course, the answer is not. Speech is biological. Reading and writing are not biological. Reading and writing are certainly species specific, which is like, for example, driving a car or playing chess, but they are far from being universal in humans. No universality. Maybe you have societies that can speak but don't have a writing system. A person who has not learned to read and write will experience severe social disadvantages in many cultures, but it is not considered what a pathological condition. Written language is a cultural phenomenon in stark contrast to the biological-based spoken language, as we said. Unlike spoken languages, that is to say, written languages vary greatly in the way they are organized and represented. Study questions. Number 1. When psycholinguists say language is biologically based, do they mean that language has no social or cultural basis? Number 2. How does the universality of language support the view that language is biologically based? Number 3. Chimpanzees and gorillas have been taught rich communication system using symbols of various kinds. Does this satisfy the claim that language is species specific? 1. Why and why not? Number 4. If a child has normal hearing but fails to acquire language, the child is judged to have a pathological condition. Explain the reasoning behind such a diagnosis, making reference to the biological basis for language or of language. Number 5. What aspect of language did Jenny fail to acquire? What did she acquire? What does this say about the critical period for acquisition of a first language? Number 6. What is meant by the lateralization of language? How does the study of aphasia support the view that language is lateralized? 7. How do studies of brain mapping demonstrate not only the lateralization of language but also the localization of language function, in particular of the brain? 8. Why is a person with a split brain unable to name an object held in his left hand, assuming his eyes are closed? 9. What is the right ear advantage for speech? How do psycholinguists know that it is not simply a result of a general auditory superiority of the right ear? 10. What is the main difference between N400 and P600 ERP component? How does the existence of different ERP responses for different types of grammaticalities help demonstrate that language is biological? 11. How do studies of inherited language disorders contribute to the pursuit of the genetic underpinnings for language? And lastly, when language is compared to writing system, it appears that the form of laws from human biology, while the latter is a product of human culture. What distinctions between language and writing lead to this conclusion? Thank you very much.